$23.6 billion of that are sitting now in the hands mostly of Kathleen Sebelius, and they are seeking to send the roots of Obamacare into our lives and expand the dependency in us so that we decide we can't get along without Obamacare. To give you an example, if I might inquire as to how much time I have left, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman has 13 minutes remaining.
13. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this Obamacare of $23.6 billion that's sitting there being implemented, and with Kathleen Sebelius with the discretion to spend that and send it down into the send the roots down and expand the dependency class. Here's an example, and one of those examples is this. They advertised that we needed to do Obamacare because we had so many people that had pre-existing conditions, and they would be refused for insurance. And so when they were refused, they didn't have any way to get health insurance, and that it was a human tragedy. And so these huge numbers of people that were uninsurable were going to be brought into the fold of the new Obamacare under the pre-existing conditions language that already is law. But a month or so ago, they discovered that in spite of how hard they'd tried to recruit people with pre-existing conditions, and I'd remind you, we have 306 million people in America. And of those 306 million people, the numbers were supposed to be large, impressive, maybe not astronomical, of those who had pre-existing conditions and could not buy insurance. And what they found were they could find only 18,000 people, in spite of them advertising pre-existing condition insurance all across this land, 18,000 people only who had signed up for the pre-existing conditions component. 18,000. Divide out across the states. Put 50 into that 18,000 and see what kind of a problem that is. It's a small number when you divide it by the 50 states. And the states could manage those kind of numbers, or if you distribute it by population. For example, the majority of the states, including Iowa, have a high-risk pool that we subsidize with tax dollars to buy the premiums down so people with pre-existing conditions can buy a policy. I encourage that. I think that's a good, responsible thing to do. But Obamacare's pre-existing policy only had 18,000 people after a year of effort trying to get people to sign up. So Kathleen Sebelius took what she considers to be latitude within the law and decided to buy the premiums down another 40%, pay another 40% of the premiums out of this pot of money that she has that is automatically appropriated to her to a total tune of $105.5 billion, and they still couldn't find enough people to make it look like there was a reason to have pre-existing conditions policy in the federal code, and so they removed the condition that you have a pre-existing condition. Now we'll have an insurance policy for people that want to sign up with the federal government that may or may not have an illness. They may have not have been sick a day in their life. They don't even have to make the case that they've been turned down by insurance by a single company in America. They just have to sign up, and they'll put them on the policy, and they'll buy the premium down by at least 40%. This is what government is doing, and they're seeking to expand Medicaid and collapse Medicare into Medicaid. And we saw what they were trying to do under Bill Clinton's era, where, and they started this, S-CHIP, which now is CHIP, Children's Health Insurance Program, and Obamacare kind of does that in, but it was expanded within the states. It started out to be 200% of poverty will help. If you're at 200% of poverty or less, we will help pay the health insurance premiums for your children. Those are low-cost premiums, by the way. Kids don't have a lot of problems. And on the upper end of this, Bill Clinton wanted to lower the Medicare eligibility age to 55, if you remember. So if you can insure kids up to the age of 26, which Obamacare does, and you can lower the Medicare eligibility age to 55, now you've only got that little window in there of 24 years when the most productive years of a person's life, presumably, and often is the case, that the government is stepping in, requiring that you stay on, or making it, mandating that you be able to stay on your parents' health insurance till age 26. You get elected to Congress when you're 25, come down here and swear in, still on your mommy and daddy's health insurance, and come over on the government plan right away. That's what that means. I wanted my kids to grow up. But if we're going to insure kids through S-chip or CHIP or a federal mandate up to age 26 and pay a lot of those premiums out of tax dollars and then lower the Medicare eligibility age as Clinton wanted to do, and it's impossible to do in this environment today, down to 55, there's only a 24-year window. Then they would add to those at the lower end and lower the upper end of age so they got it to collapse altogether. In the meantime, collapse Medicare into Medicaid, you have the formula for socialized medicine. That would be to the great glee of most everybody on this side of the aisle, Mr. Speaker. They want socialized medicine. John Conyers, back in 1981, introduced socialized medicine policy that forbid anyone from doing health care services on a fee-for-service. They had to be on the salary of the national health care system. The federal government would hire and presumably fire everybody that worked in health care, and no one could charge a fee for it, and no one could be paid a fee for service. They would have to be working for the government within the health care system. We know what happens when government takes things over. I'd ask the American people, how's the service in the places when you go into government offices? It's about the same as it is where you go in where somebody has a monopoly. I mean, I'm not picking on government workers. Government often by definition has a monopoly. If you don't have competition, you don't be nice. You don't have to be nice. And, you know, I learned that in the vehicle registration department in the county courthouse the first time I went in to register a vehicle at about age 16. I learned that they had the market cornered. They had the monopoly. They didn't have to be nice. They could open the door when they wanted to and close it when they wanted to. And there wasn't much of any motive for them to try to find a better way to provide service for me or anyone else. However long the line was, we stood in it. If anybody wants to go to Washington, D.C., down to the vehicle parking department here in Washington, D.C., you will find the same thing. When my wife goes down to get her annual $10 ticket so we can park our car once in a while for a short period of time on the streets of Washington, D.C., invariably it's a 4-hour process, and I've had to send my chief of staff and a driver down there through a 4-hour process just to get a $10 permit because they've got an attitude. This attitude is, we don't have to service anybody, we have the market cornered. That's the attitude. Go down there and go buy a parking permit if you think Obamacare and a National Health Care Act are good for you, Mr. Speaker, or anyone else. I don't want to see monopolies. I want to see competition. And Obamacare eliminates competition, and it prescribes a product that the American people have to buy. For the first time in history, a product, a government-approved, or if they had their way, a government-created health insurance policy that a person has to buy unless you are of low enough means-tested income that they're going to pay the premium for you. This has never happened in the history of America. And how one lower court could come to a conclusion that the individual mandate is constitutional it is appalling to me that a judge could sit on a bench and come to a conclusion like that, or a panel of judges, a majority of a panel of judges, and it was 2-1, I believe, in a 3-judge panel. Think of this, Mr. Speaker. When you get your paycheck, and let's just say you've got, let's keep it reasonable, $500 take-home pay for a week's paycheck. And if your health insurance premium is $100 a week, and the government says you must buy a health insurance policy that is of a value that costs you $100 a week, what they have done is confiscated 20% of your paycheck, of your take-home payroll, your after-tax dollars, and it is after-tax dollars. And then let's just say the government decides you need to buy a General Motors or a Chrysler because we have a vested interest in that. So, and you can't drive a clunker, we're going to outlaw those. So you have to buy a new car every 10 years or have one that's within 10 years of new. They could prescribe that with the same standards that they prescribe Obamacare on us. And let's say that car payment takes another $100 a week. Now you've got $2 of $500 that are swallowed up by the government. That's 40% of your take-home pay commandeered by Uncle Sam. And then they decide that the appliance companies aren't making enough money, and you need to buy certain appliances. And I can go through this a little faster. They might decide you have to buy this diet food I talked about a little bit earlier. They might put the tax on the non-diet pop. And pretty soon, your paycheck is swallowed up. Your whole $500 is gone because the government has told you how to spend every single dollar. If the government can commandeer a single dollar out of your paycheck that they direct you to spend on a product that's produced by government or approved by government, then they can commandeer the second dollar and the third dollar and a 99th cent out of every dollar and 100 cents out of every dollar. That's what we're faced with. That's the biggest reason why Obamacare is unconstitutional, Mr. Speaker. The American people are not adequately outraged. We have a character among us. We've got a history that the product of the will of the people emerges out of the House and the Senate and goes to the President's desk for a signature or a veto, and an attempt to override a veto. That happens once in a while. That's supposed to be the voice of the American people, and we expect it because the structure of this Republican form of government, and I want to emphasize, the Constitution guarantees us not a democracy. The Constitution guarantees us a Republican form of government. That means representative. That means we don't go out there and take the temperature of the public and do a poll and decide it's the will of the people today, let's race in that direction. We have an obligation to listen to the people and understand what they want and have very sensitive antenna to pick up on the will of the American people. It doesn't end there, Mr. Speaker. It starts there. And our job is to be full-time paying attention to all the facts and the figures and all of the components and making the best decisions possible because we are representatives here in a Republican form of government. This republic is not a democracy. It isn't two coyotes and a sheep taking a vote on what's for dinner. We have liberty. We have American liberty. We have rights that come from God that are guaranteed to us in the Constitution. And I believe that God moved the Founding Fathers around like men on a chessboard to shape this nation. And I believe that for a lot of reasons. But one of them is, I can't go back on this Monday morning of 2011 and redraw the course of history and even imagine that I could come up with a result that would be half of what's been produced by this great gift of liberty and freedom, freedom of speech, religion, and the press, all the people that came here to exercise their religious liberty, their free enterprise liberty, their property rights, to be protected from double jeopardy and have a jury of their peers and face their accusers. A lot of that comes from Roman law. The reasonable Western civilization culture that lets us analyze our problems is part of who we are. They landed in a continent with unlimited natural resources at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution and settled it from sea to shining sea in the blink of an historical eye. That's America. We are a vigorous people. We got the vigor of every donor civilization on the planet, and now they want to impose Obamacare on us, and they want to raise the debt ceiling by $2.4 or $4 trillion and ask us to go further and deeper into debt and put that on our grandchildren and children not yet born. And my youngest granddaughter, Reagan Ann King, entered this world with $44,000 that she owed Uncle Sam. That's got to stop, Mr. Speaker. I thank you for your attention, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January the 5th, 2011, the Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On any given day, if American people listen to the speakers on the floor of the House of Representatives, they will come to the conclusion they sure do hate government. At the very least, they certainly don't want the federal government involved in the lives of the American people in any way. Well, I've come to the floor not to give a lecture, but to offer an explanation. Because the American people are probably puzzled at something they recently saw. They saw the residents of the nation's capital embarking on what I must tell you is a new phase of an old struggle to preserve the right to local self-government, a battle they won almost 40 years ago. You would think that the speakers on the floor who hate government would be very quick to say what is true about them. They like local government. They don't want the federal government involved with local government and certainly interfering with local government. Yet these very same speakers are the prime movers of interference with the local government of the District of Columbia. And so the residents of your nation's capital are embarked on a new phase of their struggle. And I'm not talking about the storied fight for voting rights and statehood, because many Americans now know that this is the only jurisdiction in the United States where people pay federal income taxes and go to war, fought in every war since the nation was created, and don't have full voting rights in the Congress. No, I'm not talking about that. Because unfortunately today the city is forced to fight simply to maintain local government, the local rights that are unquestioned everywhere in the United States, except by some on the floor of this House. After Republicans took control of the House in January, their attacks on the city government became so fierce that the mayor and members of the city council, almost the entire legislative and executive branch, were arrested for sitting down in the streets in front of parts of the Capitol. The world at the time was focused on people in the streets of the Middle East demanding freedom, but they were riveted by civil disobedience in the nation's capital that included the highest officials of their own local government. The sit-down occurred after the city was caught in a federal government dispute that had nothing to do with the city, about cuts in the federal budget, and the city barely avoided being shut down, although the city's local funds were no part of the fight because the federal government would not even allow the city to spend its own local funds to keep the city open. That is the very essence of autocracy. And Congress still holds on to the antiquated practice of approving the city's locally raised budget, a budget that the Congress did not put one red cent in, $4 billion raised by the residents of the District of Columbia. And House Republicans had repeatedly refused my amendments to let the district spend its own local funds. House Republicans have long rationalized such irrational treatment of the residents of the nation's capital, but holding the district hostage in a federal shutdown fight was a new nadir. Republicans finally succeeded in getting hefty budget cuts in the 2011 appropriation bill, but still refused to seal the deal until their demands to make some of the take some of the district's home rule were met. They insisted on two riders, one prohibiting the district from using its own local funds for abortion services for low-income women, which is done in 17 red and blue states because it's a matter of local money and local law. And they imposed a private school vouchers on the city because that was the pet project of another Republican, John Boehner. Mind you that this city has almost half of its children going to public charter schools. It's about the last city in the world that you would impose an alternative on, since it has already grown its own home rule alternative. The bold autocratic insistence of these anti-home rule provisions, as well as the near shutdown of the city government, finally led to an equally bold response from the city. You have to imagine that only the most provocative actions could have led the mayor of a great city and other elected officials to being escorted away in handcuffs. House Republicans have devoted their first months in power to slicing away at the city's local home rule. They took control of the House on the promise of jobs, but have yet to introduce a jobs bill. From the first day of the 112th Congress, the Republican majority has been preoccupied, mesmerized with the internal affairs of a city whose local government, like many other jurisdictions, differs with them on some local matters. This is America. Get used to it. With heartbreaking audacity, they began by withdrawing the district's vote on the House floor in the Committee of the Whole. And this vote was only granted by rule, which is why they could withdraw it, but it had been approved by the federal courts. Republicans now in this House have withdrawn a legitimate vote of American citizens who pay their full freight in federal taxes and have fought in every war since the Republic was established, including the war that established the Republic itself. After taking D.C.'s limited vote, Republicans turned to taking away the city's home rule. A House-passed harsh anti-choice bill affecting the nation's women contained an unprecedented prohibition affecting only the District of Columbia. Instead of the D.C. abortion rider that had been added, and you got to add these riders on an annual basis, Republicans want a permanent law barring city spending on abortion services for low-income women. Imagine the federal government telling a local jurisdiction that forever it cannot spend its local money on local matters that dozens and dozens of local jurisdictions spend money on every year on matters that are fully constitutional. Most Americans support the right to abortion, although many others oppose it. In the District of Columbia, we respect these differences. And federal funds already may not be used to pay for abortions. But no one questions the long-standing practice of the 17 states I mentioned, who use their own funds for abortions for low-income women. Now, I understand that these matters are controversial. That's why we have a federal union. There are some things we can do at the local level that you do not do in the nation as a whole. We demand that respect for the residents of the District of Columbia, just as we get that respect for every other jurisdiction. The struggle continues now that the 2012 appropriations season has begun. An Appropriation Committee-approved bill includes only one rider, and that has a lot to do with what I'm going to talk about in a moment. But that, of course, is one rider too many. But it does show that there is some response to an expanded coalition that's been formed, and yes, to the civil disobedience and protests of the residents of the District of Columbia. More riders could still come. More protests will come. So great, though, is the continuing danger of interference with the district's right to govern itself that a national coalition of 100 organizations who together have millions of members have come forward with a weapon D.C. residents do not have. The national organization has activated its members, their members, who live in congressional districts to warn members of Congress that if they meddle in the District of Columbia, their members will let it be known throughout their district. Most members cast these votes anonymously. You know, we knew about them here in the nation's capital, but it was hard to get word of them out. Now, organizations are fanning across the country, telling on those, as we say, who meddle with the affairs of a local jurisdiction instead of attending to the affairs of their own district. Nor has the district focused only on the Republicans. When it comes to local government, whoever makes a move is, as far as the residents of this city, subject to the same kind of protest. So hundreds of residents just a few weeks ago went to the White House and had a huge rally, the largest yet. Thousands of people from throughout the country and from all over the world were there and saw the unprecedented sight of civil disobedience right at the White House to protest the fact that the President of the United States, who strongly supported in this city, nevertheless signed on to this 2011 budget deal. I believe that that indicates that the residents are acting in a principled manner, not in a political manner. And they are saying as clearly as they can that they will not surrender any part of the home rule it took them 128 years too long to get. Can you imagine that the nation's capital, until actually 38 years ago, did not have a local mayor and a local city council, was run by 3 commissioners appointed by the President of the United States? That had a lot to do with Southern Democrats who got a hold of the district committee, and although the district was a majority white city until the 1960s, kept the district from getting home rule and voting rights because there were a sizable number of African Americans in this city. That's just how deep this went. Republicans have taken over the role, not because of race, but entirely because of politics. Whichever way you cut it, they take away our rights. And when you don't have your rights, you see no difference. You don't ask the motive. All you know is everybody else has her rights, and you are an American citizen, and you are entitled to the very same rights. You raise the funds yourself. You in your local jurisdiction, you alone get to say how those funds will be spent. The Congress of the United States finally ceded its power over the District of Columbia in 1973. It took the civil rights movement to get it done. Essentially, it shamed the Southern Democrats into finally giving the district home rule. Actually, protesters overthrew the South Carolina Democrat who was in charge of the district committee. And when the district committee lost that Democrat, there were enough members of Congress who believed in democracy so that the district got home rule. And the city gets to make its own decisions on virtually everything until somebody in the Congress pops up and says, that isn't in my ideological playbook, so you can't do it. As un-American as it gets. Interestingly, many of the newest members of Congress are among the most robust, the loudest, in making clear that they do not support federal interference. I quote from the Republican Study Committee, which has a whole 10th Amendment task force, and I quote them as saying that their intent was to usher in a new era of federalism and to disperse power from Washington back to regions, states, local governments, and individuals. How can people who have that principle now put the big foot of the federal government on the local government right here in their face, in defiance of their own professed principles? You can't have that principle as stated and not apply it right here as you vote on matters affecting the District of Columbia. The truth is that those who vote, and remember, we're only talking about controversial issues, issues like marriage equality or the reproductive choice or gun safety. These are controversial issues. But we allow people in local jurisdictions to vote one way or another on how they want to handle these issues. So when these votes come against needle exchange, for example, that has kept HIV/AIDS in large cities and small rural areas from being transmitted, only in the district did they vote to keep needle exchange programs from occurring, and what happened? It got the highest HIV/AIDS rate in the United States. That rider is an example of a rider that killed people, that led to terrible suffering, that led to innocent people getting HIV/AIDS. What did the people in the House of Representatives, in the Congress of the United States, in the Senate of the United States have to do with the desire of the people of the District of Columbia to use the same weapons that are now used throughout the United States to control this terrible virus? So those who want to dismantle our own self-government, our home rule piece by piece, better be prepared to fight. And they better be prepared to fight where they live, for they are now being targeted where they live, and not because, frankly, of these underlying issues that are very controversial, but because of the overarching principle of self-government and local self-government at that. The first trial of the 74 residents who were arrested is going on right now. A number of them paid a fine and did not go to trial. Some of them are insisting on going to trial so that the point will never be lost. This first person is an advisory neighborhood commissioner. His name is Keith Silver. He pleaded not guilty on charges of unlawful assembly and disorderly conduct. He would face up to $250 in fine and 90 days in jail. He would not be the first American. When I was a very young woman, I was a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And going to jail seemed to us to be just about the right thing to do when we were denied our rights. Now the only Americans denied such basic rights, ironically, are right here in the District of Columbia. Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much remaining time?
The gentlewoman has 10 minutes remaining.
Mr. Speaker, what has been most encouraging to us is that we now know we are not in this fight alone. Imagine having to fight against the almighty Congress when you are one jurisdiction, obviously without the means to let the entire country understand what is happening. And so most residents have no idea what has been happening and had no idea until the arrest took place. Just as when the district has been fighting for just a vote in the People's House, the House of Representatives, over and over again we find that most Americans thought we had the votes. There has been a nationwide survey done, and it is very interesting. It shows that more than 70% of the people are for voting rights for the District of Columbia, and that has been done and cut so as to see whether there are differences as to where people live, north and south, whether people have served in the military or not, whether people go to church or not. And the encouraging thing to those of us who live in the District of Columbia is that no matter how you cut it, Americans believe that if you pay federal income taxes, you ought to have a vote in this body. Yes, I have a vote in committee. Yes, I can speak as I am now. Yes, I have every privilege of the House except that privilege that created the nation, the privilege to vote, to cast the final vote. I have gone to funerals of young men who died in Iraq and Afghanistan. But I could not vote yea or nay on whether they should have been there in the first place. Surely, if the American people realized that there would be shame cast on the Congress, it has got to change. Now, the district is struggling not for the voting rights and statehood it deserves, but for the home rule and self-government it already has. It is far too late in history for any Americans to be struggling for the right to govern themselves at the local level as they see fit, and to spend the funds they raise at the local level in any way they choose. That, my friends, if you are looking to the founders, will find that that was for them a first principle. And so other Americans have now come to our assistance. And the difference between them and the residents whom I represent is that they have that vote on this floor of the House, while I do not. As they voted against, as they voted to take away some of the local rights of the district I represented, every member of this body could vote on that matter except the member who represented the nation's capital that was the object of that vote. You will not find any American anywhere who will say that that represents what they believe or what our country stands for. That is why every member of this House has been sent or will be sent a letter, and I am reading from just one part of it. Should lawmakers, because this letter comes from this coalition of 100 national organizations, should lawmakers continue to advance attacks on the District of Columbia's autonomy, we will make certain that our members in every district know how their representatives are spending their time in Washington, meddling in the affairs of a local jurisdiction, the District of Columbia, rather than focusing on their own residents and on the nation's true pressing business. I have spent my entire service in the Congress trying to rid the district appropriation of anti-home rule attachments. We were successful in clearing the D.C. appropriation bill of all of these anti-democratic attachments for the first time last Congress. We did not engage in that fight, only to have them put right back on. We did not enjoy seeing Congress play shutdown chicken with the American people either. But Congress must not even think about shutting down a local government ever again over a federal fight. During the Civil Rights Movement, we called our approach passive resistance, to tell the world we were nonviolent. But that was all that was passive about us. The operative word was resistance. Once we resisted, civil rights workers found we were not alone. Today, district residents are joined by allies who stand with us and are working with us. On this we have no doubt. The American people are with district residents when we say local laws are for local residents alone, and most especially when we insist that when it's our money, we mean ours and only ours. The nation's capital should be the 51st state by now. The city's tax-paying citizens should at least have a vote in Congress, the very Congress that demands that the citizens who live here abide by the law that the Congress enacts. D.C. residents and their local leaders are fighting with all they have. What they need most now, and what I am gratified that they are receiving, is the support of other Americans who do have the basic rights that the citizens of the nation's capital are still seeking. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back the balance of my time. Don't tread on D.C.
The gentlewoman yields back the balance of her time. And pursuant to Clause 12 Alpha of Rule 1, the House will stand in recess subject to the call of the Chair.
The House today finishing work and approving nearly $31 billion for 2012 energy and water spending. This is the fifth of 12 spending bills